In Dwemer halls, where the machines still breathe, every dinner lies uneaten and every oath feels overdue. In the next 90 seconds, you'll see why the Deep Elves did not vanish. They paid for a brass god with an entire people. The stone is cold in a way that has nothing to do with climate. It is the cold of intention. Squared arches measured to the breath. Conduits polished by hands that trusted numbers more than myths. In cities like Markarth, where modern timber rests uneasily on old ribs of bronze, you can stand in a corridor and hear the world's most patient heartbeat. Gears turning for an audience that never arrives. On benches lie tools arranged by torque and thread count. On tables, plates wait for a meal that never cooled. This was not an evacuation. It was an interruption, synchronized, absolute, and confident enough to leave the workshop tidy. What disappears with the Dwemer is not only bodies, it is friction. Their letters end mid-argument. Their factories continue the sentence in steel. Even their absence feels engineered. The evidence sprawls from Skyrim to Morrowind. Sudden silence, no smoke of funeral pyres, no accounts of plague, only a chorus of neighbours who woke to find the ground floor of history missing. The date is pinned like a tack. First Era 700, the Battle of Red Mountain. The detail is what matters. Not they died, not they teleported. The world behaves as if a clause was removed from its charter. Where there were signatures, there is a line. To read the Dwemer clearly, you have to adopt their grammar. They did not ask Magicka for favours. They tried to talk like the universe. Tonal architecture is the blunt phrase we use for it now, but in their hands it was a polite assault on reality, identifying the intervals at which matter obeys and striking the note until it yielded. Spellcraft pleads, tone instructs. Their spheres and centurions are not miracles. They are compliance written brass. You can insult their piety, never their method. If a tower needs a keystone, they will locate it. If a rite needs a bearer, they will build a substitute. That hunger aims naturally at the heart. It is hard to write the words without sounding like a conspiracist, and yet the map forces your hand. Beneath Red Mountain beat the remains of a god who tried to make a world that would make room for error. Lorkhan is a scandal, even in mythology, and his heart is the scandal's proof, an unspent reserve of meaning, humming with the kind of authority the Dwemer refused to bow to, but desperately wanted to master. You can fashion a lamp from oil. You can fashion a god from a heart, if you are prepared to pay and do not care who bleeds. By the time the Chimer and Dwemer stand opposed above the ash, the instrument list is complete. Wraithguard to make the wielder survivable, Sunder to drive the blow across a spectrum of obedience, keening to find the cut until it reaches the layer where law itself lives. These are not trinkets, nor are they mere weapons. They are the equivalent of keys ground for a lock you are not supposed to touch. The battle feels like the story. The tooling is the story. When Kagrenac raises his plan, he is not gambling on fireworks. He is attempting to alter the sentence structure of Mundus. Early answers hide in plain sight because we repeat them without hearing them. Why do Dwemer ruins in Skyrim remain powered? Because the system was not sabotaged, it was concluded. Why is there exactly one living Dwemer, wandering and bewildered? Because he was out of jurisdiction when the signature was exchanged. Why do later ages whisper about a walking brass god that warps time like soft metal? Because an engine built to argue with the premise of reality cannot help bending its tenses. The temptation is to call the disappearance a curse, but curses are personal and unrepeatable. This feels procedural. The more you walk those corridors, the more the imagery turns administrative. The Deep Elves kept ledgers you could calibrate a clock by. They diagrammed the mercy out of choices. If a rite required a bearer of divine blood, they did not look for a king, they calculated an equivalent. If a covenant needed a signer, they forged one from geometry. The last step in such a program is easy to predict. Find a power source nobody can argue with and give it a voice that never stutters. Stand in Blackreach and say the words "forbidden engine," and the cavern will answer with the soft intake of mechanisms waiting to be told the next step. The heart of their design is not cruelty, though cruelty arrives. It is certainty, a world that does not slip, a gate that opens or closes and never pretends to hesitate. For a people who called the gods liars and the Daedra tyrants, certainty was not comfort, it was ethics. The Dwemer would rather be correct than kind. They would rather be absent than wrong. You can see how the plan shapes itself into a theology of refusal. Take the heart's authority, run it through a frame no priest can dominate, and bind your future to a machine that holds the world still long enough to be revised. The object the later empire names Numidium is not merely a weapon. It is a counter-creation, a walking argument that the original bargain of Mundus was flawed and can be renegotiated without consent. You may hate the thought, but you cannot deny the elegance. A god that requires no worship and tolerates no ambiguity is the exact god a nation of engineers would build. There is a reason every account of the Red Mountain crisis fogs at the edges. Victors compose histories that flatter their fears. For the Chimera who survive, godhood takes the form of stolen fire and terrible payment. For the men who arrive centuries later, the brass god becomes rumor and then asset. But if you strip away the prayers and the politics, the outline remains. A species identified a keystone under the world and hit it with instruments designed to teach the stone a new purpose. The settlement for that act could not be coin. The largest bill is paid in kind. What kind? Think like them. If the engine you intend to start must argue with the world at the level where law lives, you cannot fund it with ore or blood alone. You must feed it your equivalence to a people, the composite weight of a civilization's will. You must present the universe with a replacement signature, and the only signature strong enough is the species' own. That is why there are plates laid forever and shoes waiting by doors. The Dwemer did not forget dinner. They were attending a final appointment with their own reflection. In the years after, when emperors taller than their shadows dream of unifying what will not be unified, brass walks again, and history kinks like wire. Chroniclers invent handsome terms for this, warp in the West, because "we employed an engine made from missing neighbors" is not the kind of line you print on coins. Even so, the echo proves the premise. A thing built to deny ambiguity does what it says on the tin. It refuses to be only legend. It keeps operating whenever someone supplies the right sort of courage and the wrong sort of conscience. No one living can show you the invoice, but you can infer the items. A people who despise gods became one, and in the process forfeited the very plurality that made them clever. The halls are not tombs. They are monuments to a decision executed with terrible consistency. If you listen long enough, the vents whisper the last truth the Deep Elves would admit. It is possible to win an argument with the universe, but the universe will demand you speak with one voice when you do. The official story is always tidy where the facts are not. In temple courts and taverns, the tale is that Kagrenac overreached, struck a forbidden thing, and the gods erased his people in righteous fury. It is a story that fits easily in a mouth and leaves no residue of responsibility. But listen to the edges and the seams complain. Why do accounts dwell so lovingly on the tools, Wraithguard, Sunder, keening, if the moral is only hubris? Why do witnesses argue about the instant of vanishing with the intensity of clerks disputing a timestamp? Because even in the pious version, you can hear a process finishing, not a lightning bolt descending. There is another thread running beneath the hymns, that the alliance between Keimer and Dwemer did not collapse into panic, but into deadlines. Tonal engineers do not sprint, they schedule. The Battle of Red Mountain feels less like someone's last stand, and more like a barrier test, executed at gunpoint. The Chimer wanted the tools destroyed or sequestered, which is exactly what you demand when you fear a lock is about to be changed and your key will be worthless by morning. The Dwemer wanted one uninterrupted moment, one unbroken note, long enough to repurpose the heart's authority. Consider the tools as more than artifacts. Wraithguard is not armor, it is indemnity, a way to let a mortal live long enough to perform a god-adjacent task without tearing like wet paper. Sunder is a hammer that speaks in chords, commanding the heart across registers no altar can reach. Keening is a scalpel that writes the final line of the order, the delicate clause where this opens becomes this opens for us. This is not blasphemy as tantrum, this is compliance engineering. If the universe is written in law, the Dwemer studied the grammar and filed an amendment. The amendment required a signer. That is the part that rattles the bones of every story that came after. Men will tell you king's blood is a shortcut to authority. Myr will tell you ancestry is a court that never adjourns. The Dwemer declined both and built a signer out of themselves. A species can be a proper noun if it is coherent enough. A choir can count as one voice if it holds pitch. That is the move the Deep Elves attempted at Red Mountain. They gathered their will, their mathematics, their contempt, and offered it as a single signature, an instrument large enough to countersign the heart. If that sounds too large to fit in history, look at the one piece of negative space the centuries preserved. Yagrum Bagan, the last living Dwemer, did not survive by resisting a curse. He was absent. He reports being in an outer realm when the event occurred. Absence is a strange criterion for salvation, unless the mechanism was jurisdictional, an act that changed the status of those present, converting a people from citizens of Mundus into components of an engine. You could not kill what the world no longer recognized as participants. You could no longer find them because they were not individuals to be found. What then did the engine do once it stood up? The first answer is brutally simple. It made arguments that could not be contested by priests. Later ages call it Numidium, the brass god, as if modesty were a spell against truth. The thing walked where law was pliable and pushed. Empires bent to fit the rectangle of its will. Entire provinces discovered that history can snap to a template. The polite euphemism is time dilation or dragon break. The uglier name is victory sold in bulk. The Dwemer had always claimed that worship merely decorated power. Their engine agreed and wrote a treaty in which ambiguity paid a tariff to certainty. The second answer is uglier still. The engine had a soul because an entire civilization was inside it. Therefore, it wanted. That desire was not the merciful kind. Imagine a choir trained on contempt for error singing through bronze lungs. Imagine every edge honed on a hatred of drift. If you listened to it move, you would not hear footsteps. You would hear judgment. The Dwemer had believed themselves beyond superstition. In the end, they built the cruelest superstition of all, that a world without remainder is the only honest world. When later rulers resurrected the brass argument for their own campaigns, they learned that borrowing a god is not the same as understanding it. The warp in the West is a useful name because it admits helplessness. Multiple cities reported mutually exclusive victories and then behaved as if they had always been true. That is an engine's logic, not what happened, but what holds. The Dwemer's payment continues to buy results long after their names have drifted into rumor. No one writes paid with a people in a dispatch, but the ledgers are there, written in clean borders and convenient outcomes. All of this might still be tolerable as legend, if not for the small experiments that echo the large one. Arniel Gain in the College of Winterhold, brilliant and impatient, tries to recreate the Dwemer's effect in miniature. He studies keening. He copies steps he does not fully comprehend. And then he succeeds in the worst possible way. He disappears into the sentence he attempted to edit, leaving behind a presence that cannot quite finish being a man. It is a parable designed to be misread as hubris. It is better read as proof. The engine's method scales. You can bind yourself to work you thought you were only observing. There is a strangely human consolation tucked inside the brass. The world, no matter how powerfully revised, resists being final. The tribunal, who stole a different share of the heart's authority, discover that godhood also invoices late. Their glory rots at the edges. Their corners fill with doubt. The city-states that profit from brass learn that administration begins again the day after victory. Even in the presence of a machine that hates margins, life redistributes them. People ask questions. Children mispronounce sacred words, and the sky does not crack. The universe, insulted, nevertheless continues. Walk again through a Skyrim ruin, with this in mind and the details sharpen. The door mechanisms are not overbuilt. They are considerate, designed for a future that never arrived. The air circulation is not sterile, it is patient. The Deep Elves did not imagine collapse. They imagined continuity under new management. What they refused to imagine was the cost accruing to their own account. In trying to replace the bearer in every rite, they forgot no bearing is free. The line they drew through the world crossed their own name. It is tempting to name this evil and close the book, but too many readers will simply choose a different villain and miss the lesson. The truth worth carrying out of the dark is dry and unfashionable. Systems must be maintained, and the price of skipping maintenance is never paid by no one. The Dwemer tried to automate the Covenant. In the moment it worked, they forfeited personhood to become the automation. When rulers after them borrowed the machine, they paid with memory and truth. When scholars imitate a gesture, they pay with themselves. If the Deep Elves could speak across the centuries, they would not apologize. They would argue that their disappearance is proof of concept, that any cost is acceptable if the math balances. That is why their halls remain frightening even when empty. You are not alone there. You are with a people who still believe something, and the belief has a voice. It hums through gears and under plates. It says, ambiguity is failure, mercy is error, a perfect edge is better than a human hand. If you ever find yourself agreeing, leave quickly. You are already inside the machine. The story narrows to a point you can touch. In a world built from oaths and frames, the Dwemer wrote a new oath and became its frame. The city above still eats and sings. The caverns below still exhale and wait. Somewhere a chronicler inks a line that tries to be both fair and kind and fails at both. That is fine. The brass does not read reviews. It only listens for someone bold enough to finish the sentence the Deep Elves began. If you ever hear yourself offering your whole self as punctuation, close the book and step into the sun. On paper, the fix after any cataclysm is obvious. Hide the tools, scatter the notes, outlaw the rites. Never let an engineer near a god again. In practice, empires turn every forbidden thing into inventory. The Dwemer's disappearance should have turned brass into a curse word. Instead, it became a procurement category. Governors prefer solutions that can be shipped. Generals prefer power that can be pointed. Priests prefer miracles that arrive on time. A walking argument in metal offered all three, and so the world learned to pretend that the price had been paid by someone else and would not come due again. You can sense that pretense in the way later ages rename what they fear. Numidium sounds ancient and safely distant, a dead tongue for a living temptation. Records speak in euphemisms. Artifacts recovered, projects activated, outcomes stabilized. In taverns, the story still plays as legend. In chancelleries, it reads like a schedule with security clearance. There is a reason dispatches talk about convergence and harmonization, when they mean that several incompatible victories are now simultaneously true. Language tries to launder the strangeness. The result is policy built on a phenomenon everyone privately hopes will behave itself. But an engine composed of wills does not sleep, it idles. When you wheel it out and stand it on a border, it enforces a tone as surely as any choir sings a note. People in its path feel the world thicken into geometry. Messy geographies that used to take 100 negotiations to traverse suddenly fold into a single corridor with a locked door at the end. The lock answers to the same thing it answered to under Red Mountain, a signature that looks like certainty. What counts as certainty is the only part that changes. Sometimes a god's breath, sometimes an emperor's emblem, sometimes a document that believes itself too hard to tear. The temptation to build versions of the Dwemer's method at human scale never really fades. Colleges and courts both attract minds that would rather fix the sentence than argue about it. In Winterhold, the lesson is patient and cold. If you recreate the steps without understanding the cost ledger under them, you don't merely fail, you succeed in the wrong direction. Arniel's shade is less a ghost than a receipt. He paid with presence to demonstrate a principle his mentors treated as theory. The college will write this up as a cautionary tale about obsession. It is better understood as small-scale confirmation. The Dwemer's program is modular. Reality listens to the right kind of precision, even when it arrives from a student with a shaking hand. All of this returns you to the rooms where decisions about civilization are actually made. Council chambers, hidden shrines, a smithy at midnight, where someone brave and tired weighs a key in their palm. The ethical problem is not whether an engine works. You already know it does. The problem is what kind of world you purchase each time you flip it on. A world optimized for victory cannot help taxing memory. Ambiguity is where mercy hides. Cut too much of it away, and law becomes a blade you cannot sheathe. The Dwemer built for certainty and paid with variety, of thought, of temperament, of error. They are precise forever now. They will never again be wrong in the small human ways that make forgiveness matter. What makes the Dwemer story linger is that the bill continues to arrive addressed to others. When a province thrives after a historical knot mysteriously resolves itself in its favor, citizens sing. A generation later, they struggle to remember what the knot was. When a treaty clicks into place with a neatness no negotiator can fully explain, scribes cheer their own clarity. Later, the margins of the document grow brittle, clauses read as if carved by someone who hated footnotes. That brittleness is the shadow cast by a machine that prefers yes/no to yes/and. Even those who think they have moved beyond brass reproduce its manners. They dislike questions that take more than one answer to satisfy. It is easy to mock the Dwemer's supposed atheism in a land where dragons speak and gods walk. It is harder to admit that their refusal to bow was less adolescent than administrative. They hated the way divine stories slurred into custom, and custom into corruption. Their response was to replace trust with tooling. You can sympathize without applauding. You can even borrow their discipline without borrowing their contempt. The cleanest counter-ritual to any engine is stubbornly civic. Choose successors before crisis. Rehearse the rite before the festival. Make oaths so clear that even a tired reader can keep them. Empires fall not because enemies are clever, but because maintenance feels boring until it is fatal. Down in Blackreach, the mechanisms still exhale. If you stand long enough by a railing and let the blue light rinse the edges of your thoughts, you can feel why the Deep Elves found the path they did. The world above is always smudged. Harvests fail, judges blink. Storms arrive a day too early. Down here, valves obey, bridges extend, keys turn. The difference is seductive. It is also the trap. Communities cannot live at that pressure without turning into instruments. People need a margin to breathe, to change their minds, to forgive. The Dwemer prized truth so hard they sanded the world until it fit a straight edge. When it finally lay smooth under their hand, they discovered there was no hand anymore, only the straight edge. And yet, the engine they built does something they never intended. It teaches the people who survive it. After the gates slam shut, after the last brass footstep fades, officials with ink on their cuffs start asking uglier, better questions. What vows matter enough to put on paper big enough for a city to read? Which rituals accomplish work, and which are theatre pretending to be work? Who is allowed to interrupt a ceremony if no one remembers why the words were ordered that way? Every time a clerk answers one of those questions honestly, a little of the engine's fatal tidy-mindedness dissolves, without losing the discipline it demanded. That is the strange hope threaded through a story of disappearance. The Dwemer erased themselves into function to get a world that would behave. They succeeded, briefly, and then watched others borrow their success with less and less understanding. The residue of those experiments is a set of habits you can keep without inheriting the hate under them. Do not worship your tools. Document what a promise does. Refuse to pretend a miracle is anything but a system you neglected to learn. In temples and workshops, the same sentence ought to be posted at eye level. Power is a schedule. Keep it, or someone else will keep it for you. By the time you climb out of the ruin and the sun cuts the snow glittering across your palms, the outline has settled. The forbidden engine was not merely the brass god that strode across maps. It was the program that allowed such a stride. Frame, stone, story. The price was paid in a currency governments prefer not to list. The receipt is legible to anyone who still hears the machines breathing in the dark. If you care to listen, the lesson is not complicated. Win less perfectly. Maintain more faithfully. Leave room for mistakes and for mending. And when someone offers you a victory that erases the need for either, ask them what they intend to feed the engine this time. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of a library, a student's finger pauses above a line in a forbidden book. Somewhere, in a counting room, a steward locks a drawer and decides not to sign. Somewhere, in a ruin, a traveler lays a hand on a warm pipe and realizes that certainty can be beautiful and still be wrong for living in. The world will always have room for engines. The task is to keep them outside the places where children sleep. The aftershocks are easiest to see where cartographers give up. In dusty archives, you can find maps that disagree with their own margins. Shornhelm here and there both. Daggerfall expanded and restrained. Wayrest crowned and uncrowned in the same year. The polite term that files this embarrassment is the warp in the West. People who like order call it a miracle of diplomacy. People who know what brass sounds like when it starts moving call it something else. The Dwemer would have called it proof that their math travelled well. It is not that time broke as a vase breaks. It is that the record learned to agree with more than one outcome at once, because an engine insisted on a template, and the world obliged without asking how. Older tales dress the first triumph of the brass god in imperial colours. The story runs, a general with a dragon's name sought an advantage that could not be argued with. Advisors with the kind of ambition that burns clean provided it. A heart-shaped absence was stuffed with a substitute. A soul was mortgaged to power a god that hated plurals. And a continent realized that sovereignty feels different when it is being measured instead of sung. These are not courtroom facts. They are testimonies, and they contradict in the details. That is the point. No two witnesses agree on the timbre of the footfalls, but they all agree that borders lost the right to be messy for a while, and then forgot they had ever been anything else. If you look for a moral that flatters your side, you can always find one. Some historians claim the engine tamed chaos and made prosperity possible. Others insist prosperity purchased on those terms always arrives smelling faintly of amnesia. The only clean thing is the through line. Whenever someone locates a way to stand where law is soft and pushes, with an argument built of brass and will, the world obliges and then charges interest later. That interest is memory. The ledger tightens, the hymns get shorter, the margins in which ordinary kindnesses live are squeezed until they squeal. It can take a generation before anyone notices they no longer know how to disagree without calling a god. The Dwemer did not leave sermons, but they left a culture shaped to a theorem. If you want to resist that theorem, you cannot only outlaw the artifacts. You have to rebuild the habits engines erode. You have to praise a treaty even when it takes too long. You have to protect officials who say, "I don't know yet," from courtiers who want an answer in bronze. You have to keep festivals that look like theatre, but secretly keep the calendar, teaching people what time means. This is the quiet counter-magic the world performs after every brass miracle. Re-hallow the ordinary, so the next man who proposes a shortcut hears laughter before applause. In the colleges, the lesson grows teeth. Students pass around copies of the forbidden commentaries the way children pass songs, convinced that their nimbleness will let them dodge what slower men paid. The lucky ones fail loudly and publicly. The unlucky ones succeed for a heartbeat and come apart in the echo. Everyone writes this down as an academic tragedy and funds a subcommittee to study safety procedures. The smarter masters change the curriculum. They make first years copy by hand oaths that govern bridges and ferry schedules. They take their best apprentices into the ruins and stand them beneath a motionless piston and say, "This is beautiful. Do not live here." Above ground, the temple staff relearn the weight of syllables they had turned into ritual noise. In the years after any crisis, you can hear clerks whisper particular names before they sign, not as charms, but as acknowledgements. We are not alone in this room. We never were. The place itself remembers. A city does not need to be pious to keep its doors from becoming opinions. It needs to remember that law is a thing you speak as much as a thing you write. This is why the dome over a certain sanctum draws dusters every morning earlier than the rest of the palace. Clean stone teaches the hand to be steady. Steady hands teach the voice not to hurry. That discipline has nothing to do with incense. It is a maintenance schedule with better acoustics. Some will say that the deepest consolation is that the Dwemer got what they wanted, and we did not. They escaped contingency, and we still live among it. That is a comfortable story, and probably false. If the engine really is, as the model suggests, a frame, a stone, a story, then the Deep Elves did not leave the world so much as become part of the way it can be made to behave. We live among them because we live among their success. Every time someone proposes a solution that arrives on time and erases the need to be patient with your neighbor, you can hear them clearing their brass throat. Every time someone says, "This will be easier if we forget what happened yesterday," a warm pipe hums in a cavern that has not cooled in 4,000 years. This does not require despair. It requires housework. It requires someone who is not tired to sit by a lamp and copy a line that says, "We will not change the lock without asking the street." It requires a watchman who knows when to forgive a late arrival and when not to, and who can explain the difference without reaching for poetry or threat. It requires a ruler who understands that an oath is a kind of tool that wears with use, and that the right answer is not to invent a tool that never wears, but to train people who like the cleaning. None of this makes a statue move. All of it makes a city possible. Return one last time to a ruin. Bring no heroics with you, only patience. Touch the cold metal and listen to the hum. Think of a people who loved the feeling of a clean edge more than they loved the sound of a quarrel ending in laughter. They made a bargain on those terms and kept it. The price is written everywhere. The light turns the oil to amber. No ghosts will answer you. You will hear only air moving through a throat that never learned to sing off key. Stand there as long as you need to understand why that is terrible and magnificent and not for living things. Then climb the stairs. When you reach daylight, the snow will squeak under your boots as if the world were apologizing for being granular. Allow it. Granularity is the opposite of certainty. It is how mornings happen. In a market, a woman will argue about apples, and both buyers will go home feeling they have won. In a barracks, a soldier will correct a recruit and then apologize for tone. In a chancery, a clerk will add a footnote that saves a village from a tax it cannot pay. No engine can manufacture those victories. They are the residue of 1,000 small failures endured by people who would rather be together than be right alone. So the forbidden engine of the Dwemer endures where it should, as warning and as teacher. It tells you what happens when a civilization decides to become a signature. It signs. And then, there is no one left to read. The answer that keeps cities alive is less elegant and more durable. Keep readers. Keep arguments. Keep rights short and meanings long. Keep one room where speech has to be perfect, and let the rest of your streets be full of sentences that try and stumble and get picked up by hands that do not match. Every time you choose that mess on purpose, you refuse to feed the machine. If one night you feel the old seduction, clarity that tastes like brass, a shortcut that promises to end fatigue, say the line the Deep Elves forgot: not everything worth doing can be made clean. Then sleep. The doors will be there in the morning. They will open because someone oiled hinges and said the right name and meant it. They will close because locks are honest when people are. There is no miracle here. That is the point. We are not engines. We are the ones who decide when to use them and, more importantly, when not to. The tribunal story runs alongside the Dwemers like a river beside a canal. Similar destination, different banks, and different prices. Where the Deep Elves tried to replace the signer altogether, 3 Chimera took a shortcut. They borrowed the same heartbeat. Vivek's poetry makes it sound like dance. Almalexia's temples make it look like mercy. Sothasil's machines make it feel like research. But beneath each aesthetic lies the same accounting trick. Take power that belongs to the world's hinge and use it to convince a people that your names will hold them. For a while it works. Saints are efficient administrators. Their hours arrive on time. Their borders glow. Their enemies learn new definitions for defeat. And then the bill, as always, slips under the door. The heart demanded coherence from the Dwemer. It demanded honesty from the tribunal. Both were too heavy to carry forever. It is illuminating to hold these bargains side by side. The Dwemer paid at once with their plurality. The tribunal paid slowly with their truth. When the scaffolding of divinity finally buckled, the Dunmer remembered that a city built on a song still needs brick. The lesson is not that godhood is wicked, it is that the world treats all shortcuts as loans. Mundus is mean in that way, and fair in another. It keeps receipts. You can delay the due date by being clever. You cannot cancel it by being beloved. Anyone who looks down into the crater where the heart once disciplined its borrowers can see the shape of both invoices. There are softer parables scattered in the places brass never touched. In Valenwood, memory lives in a tree that walks. In Skyrim, lore can be exhaled as a word if your lungs have earned it. In High Rock, old towers argue like gentlemen through courts of etiquette so dense they become a kind of binding. These customs look provincial compared to a god that steps over mountains, yet each is a hedge against the same temptation. If your lore is written into living wood, and not merely into scrolls, it cannot be shipped as easily as an engine. If your authority is breathed, no one can issue it with a stamp. If your judgments wear velvet and ceremony, they might bore you into patience, an underrated miracle. The deepest counterweight to brass is not a rival artifact. It is culture that treats slowness as a virtue. Slowness forces witnesses. It ruins the appetite for erasures. When a treaty takes months to draft in a hall with open windows and too many chairs, the consensus inside learns the shape of everyone's stubbornness. That shape is the opposite of an engine's certainty. It is the texture of a life you can repair. No one sings about it. It does not make a general taller, but it keeps the day after victory from tasting like tin. Walk long enough in Dwemer places and you begin to imagine what their children were like. The rooms are not cruel. They are careful. There are benches at the exact height for small legs to swing. There are galleries placed where a pair of shorter eyes could watch a workshop without being in the way. The world they intended after their success was not a prison of steel. It was a city dressed in proof. Perhaps that is the saddest meaning left behind. They built not only to escape, but to return to streets redesigned for certainty. The return never came because the price list had no line for coming back. Sometimes the past slips a finger through a crack and reminds you that nothing is final. A scholar in Alinor writes a sentence that reconciles two contradictory edicts, and a courtroom breathes easier for 10 years. A Reach clan inherits a bronze locket and decides to forgive a feud because the inscription misnames a grandmother in a way only the other side would remember. An Argonian midwife alters a ritual by one syllable to spare a mother who would have died otherwise, and the village quietly adopts the change. None of these acts move statues. Together, they outweigh every brass footfall ever recorded. That is not romance, it is arithmetic. Small additions compounded beat large subtractions announced. If you want a ritual that resists engines, make it porous. Let someone interrupt without punishment. Let corrections propagate without shame. Write the steps so a clever child can ask why in the middle and be answered, not shushed. When a rite cannot absorb a question, the question does not die. Its energy finds a different channel, and that channel is usually a machine with no ears. The Deep Elves did not permit interruption. Their masterpiece reflects that silence. A civilization that refuses hecklers always thinks it is building a better stage. It is usually fastening a lid. The question that always remains at the end of this tour is indecently practical. So what now? You are not going to switch on a continent-sized god. You are not going to discover a beating divinity beneath your city and devise a keener clause. You are a steward who wants the clocks to stay honest through winter. A magistrate who wants to be understood at the back of the room. A teacher who wants to keep one brave student from vanishing into a clever trick. The prescription is embarrassingly plain. Schedule what matters. Rehearse the words that keep the doors aligned. Write the exceptions into the rule before crisis arrives. Reward the person who asks if the hinge is oiled. None of this makes a saga. All of it ruins the need for one. You can honor the Dwemer without imitating them. Honor their discipline by keeping your promises even when nobody is watching, not by turning yourself into a promise. Honor their precision by describing what a ritual accomplishes in the world and how you will know if it fails. Honor their appetite for clarity by admitting where you prefer clean answers to kind ones and choosing kindness anyway. If their story feels like an accusation, let it accuse you of laziness and of cowardice, of wanting miracles to rescue you from maintenance you avoided. Then go oil a hinge. There is a last mercy in the fact that the world is made of people who will contradict you. No engine can thrive long in a town where the baker argues with the bell ringer about whether the festival should begin at dusk or at the first star, and both agree to try the other's way next year. That untidiness keeps the gods honest. It teaches the air to wait for more than one kind of syllable. It is the reason children learn to sleep again after a year of monsters. Precision teaches survival. Plurality teaches home. If you ever need a line to lay across the mouth of a temptation, use this. Nothing that abolishes the need to forgive can be safely kept. The Dwemer built a thing that made forgiveness irrelevant. It did not make them safe, it made them singular. Singularity is a beautiful pose and a poor neighborhood. In the long count, wealth is not certainty. Wealth is room. Make some, guard it, spend it on your enemies sometimes. just to prove the city still belongs to everyone who can stand the sound of their neighbor's voice. By now, the hum under the earth will feel less like menace and more like weather, persistent, instructive, indifferent. It will be there tomorrow and the day after, the way tidal charts are there whether you fish or not. Learn from it what's worth learning. Take the schedule and leave the contempt. When someone around your table says, "We could end this confusion tonight if we were willing," nod and ask them what they plan to feed the engine. If they have an answer ready, smile gently and put another log on the fire. Confusion warms a room when it is shared. In a city that remembers this story correctly, you can hear a small sound at sundown that no chronicle bothers to record. It is the click of a modest lock closed by a hand that checked twice and did not hurry. It is the sigh of a clerk satisfied that today's names matched yesterday's names because somebody cared. It is a child deciding that the festival will start when the third star appears because the grandmother who taught her that had a laugh worth echoing. None of this is victory in the heroic sense. It is better. It is how a people remain themselves without paying themselves to a machine. There is a room in every good museum that no one photographs. It is small, poorly lit, and full of fragments with labels that say, "Purpose unknown." A hinge whose other half was history. A shard of glass that once distorted light into a code. A piece of brass with a groove worn smooth by a hand that never hurried. Stand there long enough and you understand why the Dwemer frightened everyone. They were the kind of people who could look at a room like this and hear a song. They would have taken the hinge home and taught it to argue with the sky. They would have given the shard a voice and asked it to recite a law. They would have filed the groove deeper until it fit a key no living throat could counterfeit. You, however, are not obligated to be so tidy. You are allowed to let the hinge remain a hinge, to enjoy the way a door opens because someone oiled it, not because a god agreed. You are allowed to tell a child that the shard is only beautiful, and that is enough. The difference between those two postures is the difference between sleeping and laying awake, listening for footfalls that are not coming. One believes that the world can be perfected by pressure. The other believes that the world can be kept by patience. A historian who distrusts poetry would insist that this is all sentiment layered onto a story that is already too heavy. But if you strip the language to the bone, the arithmetic remains. The Deep Elves found a keystone. They built a frame. They supplied a signer. The engine stood up, and the world behaved. The price was paid in a currency minted only once. We live with the residue, which is not only the hum beneath the earth, but the habit, learned by rulers and students alike, of preferring clean answers to neighbourly ones. Every era must relearn the same correction. Precision belongs in tools. Generosity belongs in towns. That correction looks dull on a day-to-day ledger. It is the clerk who drafts procedures for succession before the celebration. It is the festival committee that leaves 3 minutes of breathing space between trumpet calls in case a child laughs at the wrong moment. It is the guild that writes down how to undo its own decisions if they injure the weak. None of that is epic. All of it is a negation of brass. Engines are allergic to slack. They require the world to meet them at right angles. Cities survive by keeping a little curve in their streets. If you ever doubt that such small matters hold against machines, return to the Temple of the One in memory. Not to the Dragon of Stone, leave the miracle to the chroniclers, but to the way a door can make 1,000 people breathe at the same time. There is a long practice embedded in moments like that. Lines formed without shouting, whispers learning which syllables are heavy, a steward listening for echo and choosing to wait for the second one before nodding. An engine can coerce synchrony. Only a people can choose it. The choice is the whole dignity of the thing. It is fashionable in certain circles to announce that the Dwemer were right about almost everything, that gods are administrators who learn to sing, that rituals are operating manuals with extra adjectives. That mercy is a luxury. Fashion always mistakes clarity for wisdom. The truth that outlasts fashions is older and uglier. Mercy is maintenance. It is the thing you do to keep systems from claiming more than they need, the way you sand an edge so it doesn't draw blood every time someone brushes past. A civilization that practices mercy as a schedule does not need engines to enforce order. It has hands and habits. The last gift the Deep Elves accidentally left us is a mirror that does not flatter. It shows how quickly hunger for certainty turns into contempt for conversation, how quickly contempt turns into programs that treat voices as noise, how quickly those programs start asking for more of you than you meant to give. If you find that mirror unbearable, you can face the other direction and call the story legend. If you can bear it for a minute, it will save you from the next smooth-talking machine that offers to finish the sentence for you. So keep the sentence. Let it be longer than it needs to be. Let it be interrupted by someone who is late and sorry. Let it be corrected by a novice who pronounces a holy word with the wrong stress and makes everyone smile. Let it end with a period written by a hand that shook and steadied. The Dwemer believed that such sentences were mistakes to be erased. The world, which is less pure and more beautiful than they wanted, believes those sentences are the only ones worth reading. When you leave the museum, the street will sound like itself. Vendors drifting toward the pitch that sells. Guards trading jokes that keep the night from hardening. A bell that is rarely on time and therefore beloved. You may think for a heartbeat that all this noise is the opposite of power. Then you will notice the door you just used, closing softly on a latch that has been cared for by someone whose name you do not know. That is power too, measured in mornings unmarred by brass. And if, in some future season, a scholar with more ambition than sense produces a diagram that promises to settle an old quarrel by standing a machine on it, you will have a reply ready. Ask them what they plan to feed the engine. Ask them who will be missing from the room the next morning. Ask them whether the victory they crave is worth replacing a city's voices with a single, permanent tone. If they cannot answer without wincing, close the folder and go oil the hinge. The Dwemer's forbidden engine is still down there, at least in the way that matters. It is not the Colossus. Those footfalls are long gone. It is the idea that any problem worth solving is best solved by abolishing the space where disagreement lives. It is persuasive. It is fast. It breaks clean. It pays with things you only notice after they are gone. Tell this story until the children can recite the bill. Teach them that sometimes the kindest act is to leave the puzzle unsolved for one more night, to let the city ask again in the morning, to prefer a door that opens for hands over one that opens for signatures. Next time, we will follow the other bargain born at Red Mountain, the Tribunal's divine loan, and read how a slower bill found its way home.